Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I do want to say that it's a pleasure to come back to Cambridge thinking that I sat in this room 46 years ago, but there were no pillows at the time. There was only hard boards to concentrate the minds. The lighting was just about the same, I must say. So I hope that it would be possible for me to express my gratitude to the organizers of CRASSH who have invited me, and to Sir Ronald Grierson for his generosity in making this series possible. I do want to present a linked interpretation in these three lectures because it's clear that the material that I'm trying to introduce here is much larger than my capacity to summarize it in three small lectures, short lectures. And what I would like to do is to simply raise some issues about the fact that over the 20th century, representations of war have changed radically. And I want to present a series of interpretations about the languages and symbolic forms through which those representations are expressed, through writing, through figuration, and through film. So this is a series of lectures about the field of force between history and memory. And today's lecture is about writing war, in which I want to argue or persuade you that language frames memory, and that language is a critical element, if you will, a critical mediator in how we look at war in different countries and in different ways. Of course, writing about war encompasses all literary traditions in the same way as configuring war traverses the centuries since Lascaux. And just as filming war has been embedded in the medium ever since the first moving pictures were made, all are imaginative leaps aimed at transmuting something both ubiquitous and hard to grasp. The cultural history of war is the sum of these efforts, among others, these signifying practices through which we have tried to see and to make sense of those forms of collective violence we call under the heading war. Now, since 1900, this effort has become even more difficult. And that is because the institutions of war have mutated, and so have literary, figurative, and filmic efforts to capture some of its multiple meanings. As war has changed, so have the stories and images we create about it. These lectures are about some of these efforts and the ways they have changed over time. I want to use this one image as the leitmotif of all three lectures. On the left is the Angelus Novus of Paul Klee. On the right is an installation by Anselm Kiefer, currently in the White Cube Gallery in Bermondsey. It's called Birdsong, and it is, in my view, it captures the meaning of all three of my lectures, in that the angel of history confronting the horror of war has a human face in 1914. The angel of history in 2012 has no face. He is faceless. The face has been replaced by burnt books. That, in a snapshot, is the kind of transformation that I want to talk about in these three lectures. Now, in a field as vast as this one, modesty is a necessary response to the sheer scale of the subject. No one historian can write of war since 1900. All we can do is to look at some of its features and how they have been filtered through the works of imagination provoked and precipitated by violence. In these three lectures, I begin this uphill climb without pretending for a moment that I will reach the summit. Samuel Johnson liked to say that every time he trudged up the steep slopes of a moral problem, he passed Plato coming down the other side. In the field of war studies, alas, there is no Plato. Clausewitz, as brilliant as he was, stopped a little short of the Battle of the Somme. And that's because war, like a mutant virus, keeps changing its form and technology. It keeps multiplying its cruelties. I prefer to adopt an uncertainty principle here, making clear that what I offer are small flares to lighten up a very dark landscape. Fernand Braudel once wrote that we know as little of war as we know of the true nature of matter. He was right, but it is evident that we must still try to understand it anyway, to show anyone who will listen or look the shape of the horror of the plague that it is. Now, the 3 lectures I shall give are limited. They're selective, inevitably so, and they can't possibly be comprehensive or fully adequate to the task. They aim to explore mediating languages and symbolic forms which writers, artists, and filmmakers have used to represent war since 1900. Now, this attention to form and language in history is hardly original, but we should recognize that neither is it fully welcomed in our profession. It is both a challenge and an honor, indeed, to have been invited to speak on these subjects and in this manner today here. Now, what we know of war is always mediated knowledge and feeling. It is always mediated. The event itself, what Walt Whitman called the red thing, the actual killing, is beyond us. We need lenses to filter out some of its blinding, terrifying light in order to see it at all. I want to draw attention to these lenses, these mediating forms and languages, as the elements which make understanding war possible at the same time as they limit what we see. Now, one such element is linguistic in a straightforward sense. My argument today is that language frames memory. That's a more controversial statement than it may appear at first sight. I will try to persuade you today that whatever language we utter, in whatever language we speak differently of war from those who speak in other languages. I take English and French as my points of reference, where I've been working for the last 40 years. Those learned in other languages can test this hypothesis easily enough. My claim is that languages of war, like those of peace, are neither interchangeable nor are they transparently equivalent. I've worked with a group of French historians for 30 years, constructing and now maintaining a museum of the history of the First World War in France. And in writing this lecture, I realized that over 3 decades, I haven't a clue as to what they were saying. And neither have they understood my language. Now, what I want to say is that the different languages that we use to talk about war bring history, music, memory with them. We have many languages of war, and once we realize that fact, we can register the uncomfortable conclusion that the mountain of literature we have about war is one of the real towers of Babel of our time. I will try to persuade you that language frames memory by addressing one question which highlights such linguistic and cultural differences. The question is this: why does Britain have great war poets, a compound noun, while all other competent nations have poets who wrote about war individually and not collectively? Why does Britain have war poets and other countries have many poets who write about war? The answer is, I believe, in part, in the different connotations and denotations of the word glory in different languages. That is the key to my argument. Next week, I will address painting and sculpture in an effort to show that figuring war has had the capacity to reduce and at times to leap over some of these language barriers. Putting a face on war has a history, and as I will try to persuade you, it has been one primarily of progressive effacement since 1900. That's what Anselm Kiefer is doing today. In my final lecture, I will address a central problem in the framing of war in film, clearly a powerful mediator of representations of war. That problem is to determine how filmmakers choose, and they all do, between what I have termed the spectacular and the indirect approaches to making war films. Anyone who's seen War Horse recently will know what I mean. Both have been mainstays of the industry since its foundation, just in the nick of time for the arrival of industrialized assembly line violence in 1914. My claim is that the genre of war films has a history, a shift in approach over time, which always runs up against the immovable limit condition of the art. That is, every attempt to bring us to war inevitably fails. Once again, I emphasize the tentative nature of these claims. No one can capture war within his grasp or even imagine it fully in his mind, but we can and must recognize the astonishingly varied way people have tried to convey some of its nearly hypnotic power, that uncontrollable avalanche of violence which is still there and which is writ in the war memorials of all Cambridge colleges. If you want to see what I mean by hypnotic power, simply have a look around this university and around the houses that mourn their own individually. Remember, Trotsky was said to have remarked, "You may not be interested in war, but war is very interested in you." I think we have to return the compliment, and I've spent my academic life doing so. So today's inquiry, simply framed, is directed at providing an answer to a conundrum. Why is it that a selection of British war poetry written during or about the 1914-18 conflict still serves, a century later, as a British cultural archive of popular images and phrases associated not only with that war, but with war as such? Archives are always selective, and of course this one is no exception. By no means was all war poetry written by trench soldiers, and by no means did all trench poetry enter the canon. But over time, a loosely defined set of such poems took on a metonymical function. The part stood for the whole. My question is, when and why did this happen? One reason that this small selection of soldiers' war poetry became iconic is that it struck then as now a popular chord. And I believe that chord had a linguistic form. It captured a sense, widely and though certainly not universally shared after the armistice, that the First World War was an exercise in futility. By the way, a word that can't be translated into French. Try. And that older languages of grandeur and glory had to be recast in the light of what some soldiers saw and felt during that war. That recasting is part the achievement of war poetry. In effect, what the British war poets did was to clean up the English language, degraded, they believed, by propaganda and civilian euphemism concerning events and cruelties most people at home could hardly imagine. War poetry brought the language of industrialized war down to earth, down to the muddy earth of the Western Front, and thereby provided a specifically British poetic pathway beyond glory. In a moment, I will suggest that slow but measurable changes in the English language of glory, as opposed to the French or the Irish, provided the framework for their work and for its resonance, its lingering appeal. In other words, language was changing before the war poets developed their particular iconic contribution. In no other country that I know did the vast array of poetry produced during the Great War yield such a discrete body of materials which came to constitute for Britain what Jan Assmann has termed a repository of cultural memory. This is how he understands the term. Cultural memory has its fixed point. Its horizon does not change with the passing of time. These fixed points are fateful events of the past, whose memory is maintained through cultural transformation, texts, rites, monuments, and institutional communication, recitation, practice, observance, A-levels, for example. We call these figures of memory. In countless villages, towns, cities in Britain and Northern Ireland, such recitation, practice, and observance, time and again, has linked the words of the war poets with public remembrance of the Great War. It is in this sense that we can speak of a body of poetry written by soldiers of the Great War as having provided a kind of cultural memory, an archive, a timeless register of terms and images through which later generations still frame their understanding of the 1914-18 war and its aftermath. My claim is that what Jan Assmann terms cultural memory operates differently in different languages. Now, it is partly in language and partly in history more generally that we can find some clues to answer the question as to why is there voluminous poetry about the 1914-18 conflict scattered throughout the world, probably more poetry, bad poetry included, than ever written before. In most major newspapers all over Europe, and not only Europe, poems were the stuff of the press of 1914. But why is it that war poetry, understood as a compound, inseparable noun, a discrete corpus of writing, why did it only happen here? I want you to take with me briefly a journey across the Irish Sea to provide a clue, the first clue to the answer. And I want you to do it with me in 1936 and to encounter that extremely truculent war poet himself, William Butler Yeats, who was standing and explaining, with all of his lack of modesty, the omission of the poetry of Wilfred Owen from his Oxford Book of Modern Verse in 1936. His view was that Owen was not a poet worthy of the name because passive suffering is not the stuff of poetry. And I quote, "I have a distaste for certain poems written in the midst of the Great War. The writers of these poems were invariably officers of exceptional courage and capacity, one a man constantly selected for dangerous work. All, I think, had the military cross. Their letters are vivid and humorous. They were not without joy, for all skill is joyful." This is Yeats. "But felt bound, in the words of the best known," this is Owen, "to plead the sufferings of their men. In poems that had for a time considerable fame, written in the first person, they made that suffering their own. I have rejected these poems for the same reason that made Arnold withdraw the Empedocles on Etna from circulation. Passive suffering is not a theme for poetry. That's William Butler Yeats. In all the great tragedies, tragedy is a joy to the man who dies. In Greece, the tragic chorus danced, unquote. When he learned that some were shocked at the exclusion, Yeats elaborated on his Olympian disdain for Owen, calling him, quote, all blood, dirt, and sucked sugar stick, unquote, and judged him to be, quote, unworthy of the poet's corner of a country newspaper. He famously concluded, there is every excuse for him, but none at all for those who like his poetry, unquote. Now, I want to suggest that the excuse for him and for those who like his poetry was that Owen's work operated within a linguistic grammar and register of emotion different from that of Yeats and many other writers in Ireland and on the continent. This is not to say that there was only one voice in which either Yeats or other Irish poets spoke on this subject. It is rather that the shadings of meaning read into war differed in Ireland and in Britain for the same reason that their histories and their language diverge in important ways. The same, I believe, is true, and maybe even more so, in the case of French writers. The point here is to highlight what was particularly British about war poetry by stepping outside of its literary and historical boundaries. When we do so, we can see that the British register of what came early on to be called war poetry moved beyond glory. That's the phrase in 4 of Wilfred Owen's letters. Or in Yeats's language, beyond the tragic joy he believed to be essential for the poetic act. Tragic joy, I put to you, was not the register of Owen or of much of British war poetry, because life in the trenches had blown such notions to pieces. Now, Yeats's choice, paradoxically, highlights the character of much British poetry of the Great War and the reasons why a socially constructed corpus of work became central to the way later generations in Britain have imagined the 1914-18 conflict. The war poets pointed to a way beyond glory. At the very moment, the word had lost its purchase in describing the fate and fortune of the men who had fought in the Great War. That was their achievement, and the reason their work had such enduring resonance among generations of readers. Now, the significance of the poetic archive of the war is independent of the representative character of the writers or of their views. Much ink has been spilled unnecessarily, in my view, in challenging the view that the war poets' words are misleading in constructing the way ordinary soldiers saw the war. This is Corelli Barnett's position. There are many others who've argued the same way, that they're unrepresentative. It should simply be pushed aside. Skeptics argue that Owen Company did not share the working class attitudes of the overwhelming mass of soldiers who served in the ranks. Such men, they hold, had difficult lives. And, this is Corelli Barnett, I quote, living in a ditch in Flanders is not fundamentally different from living in urban or rural poverty before 1914. They were proud of their war service and did not shrink from boasting about it. Now, some of these claims are true. They're just beside the point. What matters is that the words of the war poets reverberated. Listeners matter as much as the producers of poetry. And millions of readers have been drawn to their work, still in print long after the armistice. What the Germans term Rezeptionsgeschichte matters. Cultural archives are selective, of course they are. Inclusion and exclusion reflect very broad trends in consumption, as well as in the production of texts, independent of their authors. And in addition, of course, this is an achievement that the poets themselves had no idea about. Unlike the Auden generation or artistic circles like the Fauve, the Impressionists, war poets, many of them died before they could have had a say about being placed in a group with other war poets. That the British war poets have entered the English language cultural archive, in my view, is indisputable. I return to the central question, why is it here and not elsewhere? Now, one answer is that the British war poets spoke a certain kind of English, a poetic language that was precisely that, English rather than French or German or Irish or American English. In this part of his work, Yeats, who after all wrote his own war poetry, had his own views about modernism, which made him dislike Owen, among others, as too Victorian, and spent a good deal of the war in London. Nonetheless, I think it's true to say that Yeats inhabited a poetic and literary space closer to that found in France than to that he found in Britain during and after the war. And I want to make this, as it were, geographical impossibility of putting Ireland closer to France than Liverpool. What I want to say is that many Irish writers of the period and many French writers still saw glory in war, in part because it was still possible to use that rhetoric, and for two principal and general reasons. Writers in both countries had at their disposal an older revolutionary rhetoric in Ireland and in France, which they adapted to the issues of the day, a tradition that was by and large absent in Britain. And secondly, because Roman Catholicism in Ireland and in France kept the notion of glory alive among communicants and freethinkers alike in both Civil War Ireland and Republican France, but not in Britain in the same way or to the same degree. When Yeats wrote of the men of the 1916 insurrection, he claimed, as we know, that a terrible beauty is born. In doing so, he was speaking out of a romantic tradition of 19th century insurrections alive not only in Ireland but also in France. Think of Victor Hugo's paean to glory in his 1831 poem Chant du Crépuscule, honoring those who died in the revolution of the previous years. Ceux qui pieusement sont morts pour la patrie ont droit qu'à leur cercueil la foule vienne et prie. Entre les plus beaux noms, leur nom est le plus beau. Toute gloire près d'eux passe et tombe éphémère. Et comme ferait une mère, la voix d'un peuple entier les berce en leur tombeau. The glory of those who die in the course of the Revolution of 1830 has, I think, real affinities with the diametrically opposite Catholic language with which Hugo had really very little time. But the revolutionary language had little resonance in Britain, nor did the Catholic romanticism of Patrick Pearse and his brethren. War poetry in England had the room to move beyond glory because British political, religious, military, and literary traditions created an entirely different cultural environment out of which a variety of poetic and prose reflections of the Great War emerged. In other words, the Great War spoke a different language. And the memory we have of the Great War in French and the memory we have it in English have to be separated, I think, at the root. My suggestion, therefore, is that the French word gloire is not the same as the English word glory. They're not transparently convertible, and that the difference may arrive from revolutionary history and from the distinction between Catholic and Protestant usages and connotations. Now, I have an image that I hope to be able to show you. Let's see if I can. There it is. Now, next time maybe I can get a little pointer. I'm going to point to this, where it says, glory to everybody under the sun. There are 22 glories in this particular image, and I'll try to tell you what it says. This is a bas-relief in the church of Auvers-sur-Oise. You probably all know the church in your visual imaginary because Van Gogh immortalized it. This is inside that church, and the plaque was written by the village priest who knew every single one of the Frenchmen who died in the course of the war. They were people from the village whom he had raised. And what he says is homage to all of those, to mes chers enfants que j'ai élevés, you know, that I raised in the love of God. Glory to God, glory to our France immortelle, glory ici-bas et là-haut, you see, glory below and on high for those who died for you, who have died piously for the nation. They have the right for us to visit their tombs. These are words that are deliberately taken directly from the Hugo poem I just cited to you. And this is a Catholic priest doing it, citing Hugo, the national poet of the Revolution. Dormis dans la gloire. And let's see if I can find it there. You see this line? 3 exclamation points are necessary to make sure we get the point. Votre vieux curé bien fait, fier de vous. I'm terribly proud of you, qui n'a jamais désespéré de la victoire, who never gave up hope of victory. Now, I hesitate to translate the passage fully because my intention is to compare, not to ridicule. But there's something bizarre about this language in English. My point is that you couldn't see this in an English war memorial. You just can't use those words. It is evident that the curé is drawing both on his Catholic faith and on Victor Hugo's poetry, directly plagiarized as an act of national elevation of the memory of those who died in the glory of the war. Now, in the time available to me today, I have to be very selective in presenting evidence of a very different Anglo-Saxon kind. I ask you to trust me that the vicar of Auvers-sur-Oise used words found in hundreds of war memorials through France, and that the following image, the one I'm going to show you now, and again, I'm going to have to get a pointer, I think, next time to make some of these images come out, is also extraordinarily frequent. This is an image from the Imperial, now Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Suvla Bay on Gallipoli. And it is a phrase chosen by the parents of one British soldier who died in the northern part of the campaign. His name was J.M. Brown of the Derbyshire Regiment. And I took this photograph. Can you see what it says? Not glory, but a purpose. Not glory. I found 55 tombstones that say the same thing in virtually the same words. Not glory, but a purpose. And I take that to be very much a Protestant affirmation, possibly a Baptist or from dissenting churches, but the language is so frequent and so shockingly different, as is indeed the architecture of war memorials, which is another story entirely. Now, the visual contrasts that I want to draw your attention do not exhaust the evidence I want to present to you today. I want to try something slightly different, and possibly going back to what David kindly pointed out was my propensity to count as well as to read. And let me put it this way. I want to bolster my statement by adding some statistical evidence in support of the argument that British attitudes about glory are different from French attitudes. Together with a consortium of universities, Google has created a unique statistical database composed of 6 million books produced between 1800 and 2000, every single page of which has been scanned in machine-readable form. We can search these 2 billion words easily through what are called Google N-grams, or graphs, where N means the number of occurrences in print of a particular word in a particular year. Now, user-friendly software enables us to compare the frequency of the use of different words over time in a very large corpus of British books. And I'm going to present you some comparisons from Google if I'm allowed to. Yeah. This you can do on your computer. Google Ngram is easily obtainable. Any one of us can do it. This is not a sophisticated presentation. It's a sophisticated database rendered usable to anybody who wants to. And what this suggests is that this is the, as it were, frequency of the appearance of the word glory in blue and glorious in red in the period of the First World War. The First World War is right in the middle, where the dips happen. Now, it struck me as very surprising. I was very surprised when I looked at that, because I then took a look at the French. And it just goes the other way. Now, the important point to realize is that obviously there's something happening here. This is not possible to simply relate to a statistical quirk. There is something measuring, as it were, the attractiveness of using the word glory in French in a way that it wasn't attractive in using English in a series of publications that can't possibly be the limit of our understanding of the way language works. I want to suggest that that is important. But if we go further and see the same contrast over 1900 to 2000, I think you'll see something else, which is that there's a downward trend before the First World War, too. There's some periods in the middle of the 20s that are going up that require explanation. But if you did a statistical analysis of the trend line, it's downward. In other words, glory is descending. And I'll go further than that. You can see that the Second World War is a problem in France, as you can imagine. So I won't draw attention to that particularly. But if you look at the 1800 to 2000 line, what I think you can see is that glory is a romantic phenomenon. It's very much in the 1820s and 1830s. There's a nice glitch in the 1860s which indicates something that the Crimea may or may not have had a dampening effect on attitudes to it. It's not at all clear. But the point I want to make is that the discussion of glory has a history. These words have a history. They have, in many respects, a weight in our understanding of the framework within which poetry emerges. And that is fundamentally different. I'll just go back for a moment to these people. To be sure, the presence of a word in a book does not describe its weight or its significance, but I think these data are consistent with my argument that language patterns vary over time and in different linguistic spaces, and they do so and so do the way different languages encode widely disseminated messages about both war in general and about Great War in particular. I mean, one point that I'm going to make a little bit later is that this is in some ways, a British and Western Europe interpretation. It was a very interesting film called Glory, made about the role that Black American soldiers had in the Civil War. I'm not making universal statements. I'm simply saying that the use of the word glory has a history in the period before the First World War, during and afterwards, which is different from that of the French. And it is that decline in glory which provided the material out of which the war poets did their work. Now, the decline in references to glory in British books is matched by a decline in the use of similar signifiers. I could have shown you 25 more. Empire and imperial, 1880s downward. Honor, bravery, courage, 1880s downward. Crown, monarchy, king and queen, 1880s after, downward. Now, that's not to say that Britain was any less an imperial monarchy in 1920 than it was in 1880. It is just that the language of imperial and monarchical grandeur appeared in published books in Britain less in the period of the First World War than it had done 50 years earlier, and that decline continued throughout the century. Going beyond glory was in step with the times, at least as measured by the written and published word. Now, my argument is that the war poets disseminated a non-glorious lexicon about war. The ground had been prepared for them to do so. They didn't create it out of nothing. Glory be to God for dappled things, wrote Gerard Manley Hopkins in 1883. The word glory was frequently operated in a sacred register. And it is true, the war poets took the language of the Bible and turned it to new uses in their meditations on war. They were not atheists in any sense. They didn't turn away from Scripture or for romantic tropes, but refashioned them in order to frame an angry indictment of those who let the war go on without any, they thought, any good reason to do so. Now, we know, too, when we go across the channel, that nothing like the King James Version of the Bible exists in France, where a divided nation shared two robust yet contradictory traditions, the Catholic and the French revolutionary traditions, both of which configured glory in their own different ways. Each had its own rhetorical life, and to a degree it still exists today. Now, in contrast, I want to put to you, this I know is a little controversial, but despite pride in the empire and the literature of the Raj, I think glory was becoming an outmoded, even an archaic word in English, conjuring up martial images, to be sure, those of Crispin Crispian's day and Henry V, of Gloriana, the First Elizabeth, Glorious Revolution. All once glorious, perhaps, but hardly the signature, maybe outside of Protestant Ireland, of a trading nation without a standing army and whose powerful navy had the great advantage of doing her work at sea a long way away from here. Perhaps the Crimean War might have done something to remove or to knock the stuffing out of glory, but we did see that the Google engram didn't seem to indicate that, maybe. The first war photographs and the reports of the shocking sanitary conditions of army encampments trampled on notions of glory, as did much of Kipling's words about Tommy Atkins. There were many words one could use about the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, but glory is not one of them. Maybe except in the gentle mockery of Gilbert and Sullivan about who was or who was not an English man. Now, in the Edwardian period, conscription was the mad dream of a small group of conservatives, and military service in no way constituted a pillar of citizenship as it did in France since the Revolution. When Elgar and Benson wrote Land of Hope and Glory, I put to you, in 1902, I think they were trying to revive a set of images and impulses slowly but surely fading away or turning into sentimental nostalgia that we find in the Albert Hall every year. The contrasting history of the two countries lay behind the fact that the French word gloire is not in any meaningful sense the equivalent of the English word glory. In 1914, the two words carried different associations, had very different echoes. It is true, the royal anthem spoke of the king as happy and glorious, but I suspect that that choice of words arose out of finding a suitable partner to victorious. Think of the alternatives: vainglorious, uxorious, stentorious. None of them will do. In addition, church rhetoric was fading as political rhetoric in Britain. There was in late Victorian and Edwardian Britain a movement away from church attendance, which caused the Anglican Church no end of worry. There was a similar decline in the number of parishioners taking Mass in France every Sunday, but in Britain the language of politics was less and less about religious sentiment and more about social class. The Dreyfus Affair ensured that Catholicism and Republican values remained at war until 1914. My claim, therefore, is that the war poets wrestled with the notion of glory. Indeed, they wrestled it to the ground in ways that did not happen in France or elsewhere. Glory has a history, and so do the attitudes which lay behind it. That history is different in Britain, France, and Ireland, and in a host of other countries too. My linguistic competence limits me to a small part of Western Europe, but my claim is broader and open to interrogation. Changes in English usage, I claim, made the language of British war poetry ring true. That's why they have lasted, not because of their intrinsic poetic quality, although there is that to be sure, but because they found a chord which was intrinsically British. It is hardly surprising, I believe, that it has taken a full century to get Wilfred Owen's poetry into French, and that only partially. French war poetry works differently because the language of glory was, and to a degree, is still alive there. Not so in Britain. It is in these subtle cultural differences that I seek an explanation for the fact that while there is a substantial corpus of poetic work written by French soldiers, Apollinaire, for example, during and after the war, there is no such thing as a group of war poets. Fighting on French soil, French writers remained within the orbit of glory. Some British poets, now canonized as the war poets, intentionally went beyond it. Now, in the tradition of Reinhard Koselleck and his Begriffsgeschichte, the history of concepts, I will stake my claim that glory and gloire operate in different semantic systems, carrying different connotations, redolent with images and emotions arising out of different revolutionary and religious contexts. The literary and mental furniture many British soldiers brought with them to the front was not the same as that French soldiers or German soldiers carried with them. True enough, British soldiers had a reservoir of swashbuckling tales of imperial conflict from which to draw, and many could recite Kipling's verse, which I think has a darker side to it than many appreciate. They could recite, though I belted you and flayed you by the living God that made you, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. But the Raj was a long way from the Somme and Passchendaele. Glory was the stuff of other times, other places, other nations, with other histories and other sacred texts. Now, to be sure, British war poetry is not one thing. It emerged in stages over time. It is important to note a slow and uneven evolution of it from within, from that written during its first year to that reflecting the great offensives of 1916 to 18. The poetry of Rupert Brooke, Julian Grenfell, Patrick Shaw Stewart antedated the failed attempts in the last 2 bloody years of the war to break through German lines in Picardy and in Flanders. Shaw Stewart helped bury Brooke on Patmos and wrote "Stand in the trench, Achilles," a phrase harder to swallow on the Western Front, which formed the setting for much of the work of the later war poets, Owen, Sassoon, Rosenberg, Gurney, and so on. Now, this development from early to late war poetry is also not uniform. Language doesn't march in step over time. It moves forward and backward. And yet, with some notable exceptions, it is apparent that glory got a bad name during the Great War, and British war poetry was in part responsible for perpetuating it. Yes, Brooke's The Dead is a counterexample. His verse is unambiguous. He leaves a white, unbroken glory, a gathered radiance. Thus Rupert Brooke. In contrast, Julian Grenfell does not use the word glory even once in Into Battle, where we would expect such a word. He praises courageous hearts, nobler powers, the joys of battle, but glory is conspicuous by its absence. The word is absent in Hardy's Men Who March Away, too. It's an interesting, very interesting poem. Owen uses the word glory several times, most memorably, as we all know, in Dulce et Decorum Est. We know his appeal to children ardent for some desperate glory to turn away from the old lie and to stare at the ugliness of war. Less celebrated but equally powerful is the account of Smile, 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 of the reaction of half-limbed men reading a press report from Westminster, where Owen imagines they say, "We rulers sitting in the ancient spot would wrong our very selves if we forgot the greatest glory will be theirs who fought." It's the savage irony of the use of the word glory which turns it upside down. Reading this nonsense, disabled men smiled at one another curiously, like secret men who know their secret safe, unquote. And yet Owen also wrote an apologia pro poemate meo of the faces of dying men. War brought more glory to their eyes than blood. That's Owen. And gave their laughs more glee than shakes a child. But Owen insists theirs was a private language. They were not part of our world, beyond the rest of us, except you share with them in hell the sorrowful dark of hell, whose world is but a trembling of a flare, and heaven but a highway for a shell. You shall not hear their mirth. You shall not come to think them well content by any jest of mine. These men are worth your tears. You're not worth their merriment. Glory gets lost on the way. In a misogynist vein, Sassoon wrote that women were not worth their merriment either. In The Glory of Women, he scoffed, quote, "You believe that chivalry redeems the war's disgrace and need to keep notions of heroism alive without the slightest inkling of what a dismembered corpse smelled like. Glory was not embedded in war. If it lived at all, it lived in the fellowship of those who suffered together and who shared the horrors of combat. War poetry was a language of bereavement, of separation from the dead and from an older archaic language of glory in the process of fading away." And in Sassoon's hands, it was misogynist. It was quite clearly something that women couldn't know. Now, this move beyond glory and war poetry marks, in my view, a boundary between British and continental poetic responses, not only to the Great War, but to other wars. In France, 20 years later, there was resistance poetry, which to an extent had a collective character, some of which was communist. But in 1914-18, even when the invasion of France gave every reason for Frenchmen to view the war as a calamity inflicted on them by Germany, there was still no outburst of soldiers' poetry which turned into a collective body of work. The language of glory, I think, was undercut in Britain, that is to say, undermined for other reasons. One of them is dissent. And dissent during the war was muted much more in France than in Britain. With military service as the price of citizenship in France, a refusal to serve was tantamount to betraying the sovereign people. But not so here, where the strength of the call to arms in 1914-15 was that it was voluntary. And when the need for men made conscription necessary, provision was made for those who could not in conscience bear arms and take the lives of other men. Here, too, we find an absolutely striking contrast. There is no conscientious objection in France. There was none during the First World War. In Britain, the dissenting tradition was robust, and in both world wars, objections on grounds of conscience were duly recognized in law. When they arose from indisputable, transcendental, or clear religious convictions, they were recognized. When they were political, it was a little harder to do. I want to suggest that the war poets were dissenters in another sense, one which arose out of moral considerations rather than religious ones. In a secularizing nation, the war poets reconfigured conscience out of conventional faith. Their secular beliefs in their eyes led them to indict the war and the men who allowed it to go on, who were in power. Of course, the war poets were not pacifists. If they had been, they wouldn't have been in uniform in the first place. Their active service gave them the moral authority to denounce the war and the suffering it caused. Their references to shell shock are part of their dissenting legacy. A war which by its very industrialized nature drove perfectly sane men mad was one which had redefined what bravery and honor meant. It's hard to use the word glory in a ward of shell-shocked men. A new anatomy of courage, in the words of Charles Moran, had to be described, and the war poets did so, bearing in mind the faces of those whose minds the dead had ravaged. War poetry helped introduce the term shell shock into the lexicon of war, where it remains to this day. Not so elsewhere. Shell shock can't be translated into French. They don't have the same linguistic notation to describe this part of the war. And I think it's because iconic language is a language which finds a niche in the vernacular. What better instance of this than the British war poets' reference to the awkward, puzzling, frightening, and stigmatized category of psychological injury in war? By the way, there is no equivalent German or other literary response to the recognized medical category of shell shock either. In German or French, the word doesn't have the same connotations. I want to repeat the injunction that Owen, Sassoon, Gurney, Rosenberg, they didn't write their poems as a group. They weren't war poets when they were writing their war poetry. It was we created them. That is to say, the readers turned them into war poets. None of the war poets had the slightest idea that they were writing canonical texts. That was not the way they were written, but it is the way they have been read, taught, mastered, set to music, passed on to younger generations. Even in the 21st century, after every single soldier who fought in that war has died, the war poets are still quintessentially English figures. They are indeed among Assmann's figures of memory, the sentinels of the 2-minute silence of Armistice Day. They seem to stand guard over the nation's acknowledgement or active knowledge, its recognition, its eternal return to and remembrance of the catastrophe of 1914-18. Now, one puzzling question that I don't presume to have an answer is, why did the Second World War not produce its company of British war poets? It did produce poetry of remarkable quality. There were those who left poetry of great power and technical skill, but the collectivity war poets we've described emerging out of the 1914-18 war has no British analog for the Second World War, unless it's Spike Milligan and the Goon Show. One explanation, I think, is that poetry is a form of commemoration, and British commemoration after the Second World War suffered from a very difficult problem. First World War writing and commemorative sculpture was bathed in the language of never again. Those who gave their lives did so that their children would not have to do it again. Again, it never lasted 21 years. And thereafter, war casualties were heavier among civilians in Britain than in the military until D-Day, until 1944. This sense of a disappointed anti-war spirit may help us understand why Second World War commemoration and English poetry within it returned to the great war poets. The war against Japan was a more complex subject with racial and imperial overtones, but the victory over Hitler was both one which had to be won with gritted teeth and the consequences of which had to be endured. The language of that endurance was already there. The great war poets had provided it. And so it was perfectly natural, in my view, that Benjamin Britten, a pacifist composer, wrote his war requiem for the reconsecration of Coventry Cathedral in 1962, and that when he did so, he would return to the poetry of Wilfred Owen to complement and renew sacred texts. In the midst of Requiem Aeternam, right at the start, we hear a tenor rendering, "What passing bells for those who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns." Then in the Dies Irae, the baritone recites, "Bugles sang, saddening the evening air, and bugles answered, sorrowful to hear." In the Offertorium, we find Owen's Abraham, whose hand was not stayed by an angel, quote, "but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe one by one." In the Libera, May, we hear Owen's strange meeting with the man he killed. This braiding together of the Latin Missa pro defunctus with fragments of Owen's poetry was not only extraordinarily powerful, but it gave a new impulse to the afterlife of the war poets, just in the run-up to the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of war in 1914, a moment from which a new memory boom devoted to the Great War was about to take off. And the great show on launching BBC Two, the great show on the Great War, is part of this return to the war poets. On Armistice Day, 1985, a plaque was placed in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey to 16 men who wrote war poetry about and during the Great War. What better representation is there of the canonization of the war poets? I've just checked this, by the way, with Cambridge University Press down the street. What better representation is there of the canonization than school curricula, which have ensured that the younger generation have the chance to be exposed to the cultural archive of the nation's past? In 2012, I've just learned, one of the 4 awarding bodies responsible for the A-level course in English literature offered students World War I literature as one of 4 options from which they could choose for the examination. That was centrally poetry. Other awarding bodies offered similar options on war poetry for A-level pupils in English literature. You look at websites of sixth form colleges presenting syllabi and reading material, you'll find the war poets, time and again. Many similar instances can be cited. To be sure, a common education may be a body of learning we've all forgotten over time, but it is the music of the words, the cadences of the poems, which linger, at times subliminally, at times with direct effect, long after the school days. And those sounds and gestures, half remembered, half forgotten, help us see how deeply embedded the poetry of the Great War is, in the way substantial numbers of men and women still think about their country's past. So in conclusion, it may be useful to tie some of these threads together and to speculate on the peculiarities of the English. One explanation for the English Sonderweg is the extent to which the classics and literature dominated elite education in the period prior to the war. Rhetoric, Usually classical rhetoric, the historian of education Antoine Prot tells us, was more central to the curricula of the public schools in England than to that of the Grand Lycée of France or the Gymnasie of Germany. Partly, this is a function of educational reforms. In France, the Third Republic added geography and history as a focal point of the school curricula, good Republican subjects, and thereby lessened the time and space left for the classics. In Germany, the sciences had a position in the school curricula and a university life that was superior to that of their competitors. But there is a more directly political matter which may have been decisive. The outcome of the war in 1918 and its staggering human cost left deeper and more lingering doubts in Britain as to the meaning of victory. French men and women had little doubt as to the justice and necessity of expelling from their land an invading army which treated the captive population the way all invading armies treat captives. The meaning of victory was less troubling, too, in parts of the Dominions. Soldiers who had fought for Australia or Canada by fighting for Britain retained their laurels as the founding fathers of their allied, though more fully independent nations. Among defeated countries, the meaning of the war was hardly ambiguous. 2 million German soldiers had died for nothing. The same was true for 1 million men who died while serving the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Italian nationalists were outraged at their treatment of Versailles, which, despite the loss of 600,000 men, their territorial ambitions were thwarted. In other cases, defeat led to a heroic new lease on national life. In post-Ottoman Turkey, a proud national movement under Ataturk arose directly and heroically out of the ashes of defeat. They've just, for the very first time, published a volume of their war poetry in 2012. And the acceptance of defeat at Brest-Litovsk gave the Bolshevik regime the space and time it needed to assure its existence by winning the Civil War. No war poetry there. Only in Britain did the debate about what the war had achieved stimulate such ambivalent attitudes, and it still does. To Ted Hughes, the war was a defeat, around whose neck somebody hung a victory medal. The shock of war losses was so severe that the notion of a Pyrrhic victory made sense. No nation could survive such another episode in sacrifice. And once the early economic troubles of the 20s turned into the interwar depression, once brotherhood in arms turned into the embitterment of the general strike, then what possible benefit the British people had gained from their victory became a question with a difficult answer, if any. War poetry expressed ambivalence. It was proud, elegiac, angry, dedicated to protecting from trivialization the memory of men pushed beyond the limits of human endurance in a war which placed metal against men and assured that the men would lose. It offered a semi-sacred epitaph to the lost generation and offered it up to the nation not only as a memorial, but as a powerful, if vague, explanation of why Britain, once a great power, had become a country with a great future behind it. War poetry was pessimistic history, nostalgic history, elegiac history, written in a language which has endured. It is in no sense the only register in which images of war have been passed on from generation to generation, but it is there, still. It has provided generations of school children with a language for family history, their family's history, history of pride, of wounds, wounds that have never healed, as Pat Barker's novels tell us. It is to war poetry that we must turn to understand why commemorating the Great War in 2014, a century after the outbreak of the conflict, still has a taste as of ashes to it. In the space of this lecture, obviously I couldn't possibly offer you an interpretive guide to all war writing. My aim has been much more modest. It is to show in one particular case that language really matters, here as elsewhere. And language, while inflected by regional, ethnic, and social class distinctions, is a national resource through which groups of people tell stories about their past and other groups of people listen to them over time. As such, my conclusion is that phrases glory or la gloire, the Great War, alongside la Grande Guerre, are national speech acts with very different connotations and remain among those untranslatable terms who tell us who we are. Of course, there's an afterlife in the effort to go beyond glory. In 1940, Churchill's language raised defiance into an art form. Grandeur seems to me the right word for him, not glory. And 22 years later, as I said, in Coventry, Benjamin Britten's War Requiem urged us to go beyond glory in the reconsecration of Coventry Cathedral. I'd like to leave you with one unsubstantiated and daring suggestion. The war poets, I think, still matter, but for reasons you may not have considered. From the 1960s on, and with some exceptional moments, there has, in Western Europe and to a degree elsewhere, but mostly in Western Europe, been a slow but progressive delegitimation of war as national policy in a number of countries, leaving Tony Blair in 2003 with no other choice than to lie about weapons of mass destruction because he knew that the vast majority of the British public would not follow him into war. None of this shift of public opinion was possible before the liquidation of empire, but from the mid-1970s, with reversals during the Falklands and Serbia and after 9/11, war has got something of a bad name. If the European project means anything, and I use the word if, it is not, God knows, a stable currency. But maybe it is a turning away from war and a belief, or put it the other way around, a fading of a belief in the glory of war. British war poetry is part of that story, leading to the paradoxical conclusion that at least in one respect, despite linguistic differences, Britain and Europe may be finally coming together. And if so, then the English war poets deserve a plaque not only in Westminster, but maybe in Strasbourg, in Rome, possibly even in Berlin. Through the agency of the war poets, among a host of others, at last, a century after the Great War, European attitudes to war have taken on some very English shadings, and Britain has had a chance at long last, perhaps, to become the noblest European country of them all. Going beyond glory, after all, means going beyond war. And it is to that configuration I leave you where I turn in my next lecture. Thank you very much.